Okay, so we're diving deep today. You ready for this?
Absolutely. Let's go.
Deep dive into the JFK files. March 2025, we got hit with over 1,000 PDFs?
A little over 1,100, yeah. Something like 80,000 pages, if you can believe
It's
that.
crazy, right? Builds on that whole JFK Records Act from back in '92. Transparency, right? That's the idea, at least. And for our listeners, I know you're out there wanting the core of it, the good stuff, without getting, buried in paperwork.
Yeah, nobody wants to wade through thousands of pages of dense documents. We're here to extract the gems.
Exactly. That's our mission today.
Yeah.
So think of this as a guided tour, right? Through this whole massive archive. Not every little detail, but those big insights, the key investigations, the lingering mysteries, maybe even some surprises along the way.
Oh, definitely some surprises. This case is full of them.
So we're going to be touching on a lot, okay? Oswald's actions, for sure. CIA operations, definitely. And, of course, the whole conspiracy question. You can't talk about JFK without it. All of this against the backdrop of, well, some pretty tense times in history. And remember, the official conclusion hasn't changed. Warren Commission, Oswald acted alone. But these files, they give us a much deeper, more nuanced picture, even within that framework. And honestly, it's no wonder people are still speculating about what really happened in November '63.
Right, the speculation isn't going away anytime soon. And with good reason, I think. There's a lot to unpack.
Okay, so let's start unpacking. Oswald's trip to Mexico City in the fall of '63. What do we make of this?
This is a big one.
Yeah.
Always has been.
Yeah.
You're looking into Oswald's head, right? Trying to figure out what he's thinking, what he's planning. Were there any warning signs? Anything missed? Maybe even deliberately ignored? These newly unredacted files, especially the ones about Mexico City, they're a goldmine for researchers trying to answer those questions.
Right, so we're talking CIA Memo 104-0015-1003. It talked about Oswald's time at the Soviet embassy, even with some redactions. But now, 2025, those redactions are gone. So anything in that numerical range, 14-1 XXXX. If you're looking at the files yourself, those are the ones to check out. Then there's the FBI report, 124-10145-10143, all about Oswald's activities while he was down there in Mexico. It's very likely that report's been updated in this latest release, too. And remember, those 124 files, those are usually FBI stuff. Surveillance logs, reports from agents on the ground.
And all of this ties into the bigger picture. What kind of surveillance was in place? Were they tapping the Soviet embassy, the Cuban embassy? What about CIA monitoring? And here's the million-dollar question. Is there anything about Oswald talking about, harming President Kennedy? There's been some buzz. Historian Philip Shinnon, he's hinted that there might be revelations like that in these files.
And this is where it gets really fascinating, for anyone following this case. What was Oswald really up to down in Mexico City? Was he trying to defect? Was he working for someone? Or was it something else entirely? The possibilities, even now, they fuel the debate. It's crazy.
It really is. This case just keeps giving,
Mm.
even after all these years.
Okay, so let's move on, broaden things out a bit. The CIA, their activities in this whole time frame, the new files seem to shed even more light on that.
Yeah, this is a critical area where we might gain some real clarity. The relationship between JFK and the CIA, it was strained, to say the least, especially after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. These files could give us more insight into how they were watching Oswald, maybe even before Mexico City, and any propaganda they might have been pushing before and after the assassination. Now, proving a direct link to the killing, that's tough. But these details, they could suggest that maybe the agency wasn't as careful as they should have been. Maybe they even played a more active role, even if it was indirect.
Totally. We're talking about files like CIA Operational File 104-10861002. Even the older versions talked about wiretapping in Mexico City. They even had this detail about UV markings on phones, sneaky way to track who was talking to who. And now, with the new releases, we're expecting even more unredacted info. Then there's CIA Report 104-10103-10041, which touched on operations that might be linked to Oswald or even plots against Castro himself. This is another area where we might see some big reveals.
And the names, right. That's what's really interesting here. We might finally get those redacted names of CIA operatives, guys like James McCord, who, well, we all know what happened with him in Watergate. We could get more details about those anti-Castro plots, too, the ones the CIA was cooking up at the time, and maybe even more about JFK's own criticisms of the agency after the Bay of Pigs. Remember that memo by Arthur Schlesinger? Parts of it were still redacted even a few years ago. We might finally get the full story.
So what's it all mean? Well, it raises some pretty huge questions. How closely was the CIA watching Oswald? Were there internal conflicts within the agency that messed with how they handled information? And is it possible, just possible, That Oswald was, I don't know, a pawn in some bigger game. A game played by the big boys in intelligence.
It's certainly a possibility, and one that we need to explore no matter how uncomfortable it might be.
Absolutely. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, let's talk about something that popped up pretty recently. Those newly discovered FBI files from February 2025.
Oh, yeah, that was a curveball.
Hmm.
Thousands of them, right?
Yeah.
Something like 2,400 FBI records that nobody even knew existed. They got digitized and released as part of this whole declassification push.
Right, and initially people were, hoping for some big bombshell, the smoking gun,
Yeah.
but early reviews suggest that that's probably not in there.
Probably not. But that doesn't mean these files aren't valuable. They could still give us new angles, confirm things we already suspected, or maybe even change how we think about certain aspects of the case. It's all about the details, putting the pieces together.
So if you're out there digging through these files, focus on the 124XXXXXXX series, especially the ones with higher numbers from that March 18th list. Those are the ones from this new batch. They might have new info on people connected to Oswald, more details about the FBI's domestic surveillance, maybe even witnesses that nobody talked to before. It's all about building a complete picture.
Exactly. And that complete picture has to include those attempts to take out Castro. Operation Mongoose, that's a big one. The CIA's campaign to eliminate him. A lot of people still wonder if there's any connection between that and JFK's assassination. It's a question that just won't go away.
CIA document 104-100-F2-10093. That's the one. Even the redacted versions gave us some details out those anti-Castro operations. Now, with more declassification, we might finally get the full story. Who are the operatives? When and how did they try to get Castro? And is there any overlap with Oswald's own contacts in the Cuban exile community?
Now, to be clear, there's no official confirmation that those Castro plots are directly linked to JFK's death. But you can't ignore the context. Those operations created this atmosphere of covert action, political violence, and just pure hatred for the Cuban regime. Did that environment somehow contribute to what happened in Dallas? That's a question worth asking.
Definitely a question worth asking. Okay, so here's another interesting wrinkle in all these files. Records about Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., it's because of a broader declassification order, Executive Order 14176.
Yeah, that was unexpected. These files aren't directly about JFK's assassination, but they're still fascinating. They're cross-referenced, a lot of them, often starting with a 157, which usually deals with civil rights. There could be more info about the surveillance on MLK, maybe some connections to the RFK assassination investigation. It's all about context.
Right, context. Maybe there are some broader themes that tie these events together. These were pivotal figures in American history, and these files give us a new lens to view their stories.
Absolutely. And speaking of pivotal figures, we can't forget about the Warren Commission report itself. The official investigation, published back in '64, less than a year after the assassination.
And that central conclusion, Oswald acting alone, it's probably the most debated finding in modern history. You can find the report online pretty easily, 888 pages, it's all there. But the real deep dive is in those 26 supporting volumes, witness testimonies, over 550 of them, exhibits, more than 3,100. It's the raw data of the investigation.
And the Warren Commission might have said Oswald acted alone, but the debate never really ended. Why? Why is this report still so controversial after all these years? It's because of the doubts, the unanswered questions, and these new files. They're trying to address those bit by bit.
Okay, so here's something that came out of the files that's really caught people's attention. A secret intelligence pipeline between the CIA and Israeli intelligence. It was overseen by James Angleton, head of counterintelligence at the CIA.
Yeah, this is a big deal. This wasn't just routine sharing between allies. This was deliberate, secretive, designed to keep Israel's involvement in U.S. operations under wraps. They bypassed all the normal channels.
Angleton, he was the gatekeeper. Anything involving Israel went through him. And he also controlled what other agencies, especially the FBI, knew about Israeli intelligence. He was basically scrubbing reports, removing any mention of Israel before passing them on. This was a covert operation within the CIA, hidden from almost everyone. Makes you wonder, right? About hidden agendas, foreign influence, the whole 9 yards.
For sure. And it leads into something else that's come out of these files. The CIA's involvement in psychological warfare and media manipulation during the Cold War. The Califano Papers, for example, they lay out the CIA's plans to basically infiltrate global media, radio, TV, all of it. Their goal was to counter Soviet and Chinese propaganda.
So we're talking about a systematic effort to manipulate public opinion on a global scale. And, some people have pointed out the parallels between what the CIA was doing back then and what some folks worry about today. The influence of global media on regime change, political outcomes, things like that.
It's a good point. Makes you think, doesn't it? About how the legacy of those Cold War tactics might still be shaping the media landscape we see today.
Hmm.
The methods might have changed, but are the goals still the same?
Makes you think, for sure. Okay, so zooming out a bit, taking a wider view of the assassination itself, it looks like there might have been more to it than just Oswald. The file suggests that multiple groups might have had reasons to want JFK gone. Almost like a convergence of interests, but unspoken, of course.
Exactly. Take Israel's nuclear program, for example.
Yeah.
JFK was against it, put a lot of pressure on them, demanded inspections of their Dimona facility.
Yeah.
His successors, though, they were much more lenient. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not.
Then there's the CIA itself. We talked about how JFK wanted to shake things up after the Bay of Pigs, maybe even dismantle the agency. That would create some powerful enemies, people with a lot to lose. And don't forget about the Federal Reserve. JFK's Executive Order 111110 that gave the Treasury power to issue silver certificates, basically challenging the Fed's control over the money supply. That's a lot of power to threaten.
And we can't leave out the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower warned us about them, remember. JFK didn't want to escalate the Vietnam War, and that went against the interests of a lot of powerful people who were profiting from that conflict.
And then there's organized crime, the mafia. Bobby Kennedy, as Attorney General, he went after them hard, cracked down across the country. That created a lot of enemies, people with long memories and a thirst for revenge. There's even been talk that the mob helped JFK get elected, which, if true, would make their crackdown even more of a betrayal in their eyes. And let's not forget the Cuban exiles. They felt betrayed by JFK after the Bay of Pigs, blamed him for the failure.
And then there's Lyndon B. Johnson. His role has always been the subject of speculation. There are those letters, supposedly from Jack Ruby, that claim LBJ was connected to some shadowy group with globalist ambitions. It's unconfirmed, of course, but it's still intriguing to compare JFK's struggles with LBJ's success after the assassination. He seemed to navigate the political waters much more smoothly.
So you've got a president who, by making powerful enemies through his policies, might have created a situation where a lot of people wanted him out of the picture. And to add to the mystery, there's that missing testimony from James Angleton. He testified before a secret Senate committee investigating the assassination, but those records are gone.
Yeah, that's a big one. Angleton was right at the heart of the CIA. He knew everything, everyone. What he said to that committee, behind closed doors, could be incredibly revealing. It's no wonder people are suspicious about its disappearance.
So before we wrap up, let's touch on some of the lingering questions and anomalies that still surround the JFK assassination, even with all these new files.
The single bullet theory, that's the big one. That magic bullet, CE-399, its condition, the trajectory it supposedly took to hit both JFK and Connally. A lot of people just don't buy it. And then there's the analysis of the bullet fragments. Neutron activation analysis. Some studies say it points to only 2 bullets. Others say there might have been more.
Right, and Oswald's rifle, its accuracy, the sight alignment, there are questions about that too. And what about Gary Underhill, the CIA guy who claimed there was a group within the agency responsible for JFK's death? He supposedly feared for his life, and then he turns up dead, ruled a suicide. But the circumstances were strange. Right-handed guy, shot behind his left ear, gun under his left side. Doesn't quite add up.
And then there's the story of Sergei Jono. He claimed he warned the U.S. government about a plot to kill JFK months before it happened. He said he was harassed by the police and the FBI afterward. It's another piece of this puzzle that doesn't quite fit. And even with all these files released, there are still redactions, information being withheld. It's a reminder that the full story might still be out there, hidden away.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways? These new JFK files, they add to a mountain of evidence that paints a really complex picture. They show us the CIA's activities, often hidden and controversial. They raise questions about Oswald, his connections, his motives. And they point to a lot of powerful interests that might have wanted JFK out of the way, a lot more than just a lone gunman.
These new releases, they give us more detail, more nuance, but they haven't overturned the official story. What they have done is fuel the speculation, highlighted areas where maybe things weren't as they seemed, where information was mishandled or maybe even deliberately concealed.
And for our listeners, those of you who wanted to understand this without getting lost in the weeds, hopefully this deep dive has given you a framework, a way to approach this case and its many mysteries.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We just scratched the surface, really. There's so much more to explore, and we encourage you to do just that. Dig into those national archives, read the historical analyses, form your own conclusions.
And here's a final thought for you to ponder. This CIA-Israel pipeline, the secret channel we talked about, and the CIA's history of propaganda and covert action, how does that change your understanding of history? Of events, past and present? What else is still hidden, waiting to be revealed? And why, after all these years, does the JFK assassination still hold such a powerful grip on our collective imagination? Keep those questions in mind as you explore this case. There's always more to learn, more to uncover.
That's right. The truth is out there somewhere. It's just a matter of finding it.
And that's the deep dive for today. We'll see you next time. Same place, same time.
See you then.